Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with loving zeal, the poor and them that mourn, the faint and overborne, sin sick and sorrow worn, whom Christ doth heal. Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with fervent prayer, the wayward and the lost, by restless passions tossed, redeemed at countless cost from dark despair.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 5. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Masks will be available at the door for anyone who needs one. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay at home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also have classes at 9 a.m. for all age groups, so please join us for those. If you care to, you can join us in the auditorium to watch this Bible study on the large screen. We want to make sure you're aware that we have these English Standard Version Bibles available to anyone who'd like to have one. If you care to have one, just contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. Our sick list is quite long, so please refer to the bulletin for more information. But we do want to remember several who are new to the list, including Marianne Kinsey, Sarah Amix, and Camden Wilson. If you would, keep them in your prayers and keep their families in your prayers as well. There are many others who are facing surgeries in the immediate future, and I'd ask that you keep my mother, Mary McElroy, in your prayers as well, as she's looking to have some eye surgery done in the near future. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third party on the way. It was after the crucifixion, and as they traveled along, they remembered later that there had been a burning in their heart while this man was with them. They came to find out that it was Jesus who had been walking with them, explaining to them from the Scripture about things that they needed to hear. It's that burning that they had in their hearts while Jesus was with them that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy, and we find out what holiness is by going to the Scriptures and reading about it there. And finally, we want to remember the story of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam. Rehoboam learned a tremendous lesson in making some bad decisions about handling the kingdom. It was a judgment that was visited upon him because of his father, Solomon, and the things that Solomon had done that were inappropriate in God's eyes. So there was not a lot of hope that he was going to avoid the split of the kingdom, but the choices he made were not wise anyway, and it's a good lesson to look at. Jeroboam, on the other hand, was promised by God, while Solomon was still king, that he would lead the northern tribes. He lived in exile until the death of Solomon, and when he returned, he took over the northern tribes, just as God had promised him. But instead of following the promise that God had given him, he decided on his own that it would be wise to build high places in the mountains and set up a false priesthood to have the people worship there instead of going into Judah to worship in Jerusalem, as was appropriate. This was a sin upon Israel until the time of Christ. It's a terrible thing to take it upon yourself to do something that's more convenient for you than what God has commanded, and to tell others that that's an appropriate thing for them to do as well. And that's a tremendous lesson to take away from Jeroboam's experience all by itself. But there's more to the story. God just didn't let Jeroboam do that on his own. He sent a prophet from Judah. That prophet came and told the king that he was doing wrong, and there's a very interesting story about how that interchange occurred. But after it was completed and the prophet had done what God had told him to do there with the king, he went on his way home. And on his way home, a prophet from Israel met him on the way. and told him a lie, told him that God had told the prophet from Israel that the prophet from Judah should come and join him for a meal. The prophet from Judah, having availed himself of every other part of the command that God had given him, decided that this was an okay thing for him to do, that he didn't have to go on his way home as God had commanded. So he joined this prophet from Israel, and they ate together. No sooner had he sat down to eat a meal than the prophet from Israel did in fact prophesy, and told the prophet from Judah that he would die on the way home because he had failed to follow the instruction of the Lord, and he did. This is a tremendous, tremendous story with terrible implications for trying to explain to someone else what the Scripture says, taking it upon yourself to follow this direction from the Lord, to teach others, to instruct others, to follow any admonition or direction from the Lord. It's an important thing that we follow it precisely. Don't take it upon ourselves to believe anyone coming to tell us some other thing that is not in accord with what we've learned from the Lord appropriately. We've been promised that we can be certain that there will be no message from God other than what has already been delivered, and that even if an angel were to appear and tell us something different, we should not accept that it is true, but only accept the word that has already been delivered to us. So I hope you'll join me now as we enter into this study of 2 Samuel chapter 5. Next week, I plan on, Lord willing, to study out of 1 Chronicles chapters 11 and 12, which will cover some things that are not covered here at or before this point in time that the events in chapter 5 are unfolding. So we'll do a little catch-up next week with 1 Chronicles. 1 Samuel chapter 5 from the English Standard Version. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. Verse 3. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. Verse 8. And David said on that day, Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold, and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. Verse 11. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Verse 13. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nephig, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Verse 17. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim, and David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David came to Baal-perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, The Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore the name of that place is called Baal-perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. verse 22. And the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, You shall not go up. Go around to their rear, and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. Okay, so last week we studied out of 2 Samuel chapter 4 about the murder of Ishbosheth. Starts off in verse 1, when Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. So the news was very disconcerting to them, as you would expect. Now Saul's son, it says in verse 2, had 2 men who were captains of raiding bands. The name of one was Bani, the name of the other Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, a man of Benjamin of Beeroth. For Beeroth also is counted part of Benjamin. The Beerothites fled to Gideon and have been sojourners there to this day. And again, the significance of that story is a bit lost on me. And of course, as I said last week, the Benjaminites have a long and storied history that is not good, and it is unusual that God would have chosen Saul's family to be a leader of all of Israel, given the history of the Benjaminites. So continuing in verse 4 is the first part of the story of Mephibosheth. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. I'm not sure why they interjected that here, but we'll learn more about Mephibosheth later on. Continuing in verse 5, now the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rehab, and Bani, set out, and about the heat of the day they came to the house of Ishbosheth as he was taking his noonday rest. And I'm going to paraphrase this next little part because there's part of it that's missing here from the English Standard Version. But basically, as they came to the house, there was a woman who was tasked with cleaning the wheat immediately outside the house, apparently. And she was weary and drowsy and apparently had fallen asleep. And they came in the house past her as she slept and killed Ishbosheth while he was sleeping on his bed. They killed him and cut off his head. And then they carried his head back to David across the Arabah, arriving there to David at Hebron that morning. Continuing in verse 8, and brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and they said to the king, Here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring. In their minds, any son of Saul was an enemy of David. Any person among the Israelites would have been considered an enemy of David under the current war between Judah and Israel. So they bring this head of the king of Israel, Ishbosheth, to David. Continuing in verse 9, but David answered Rechab and Bani his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, Behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. So this is a very odd story. It's a very odd story. Just as the story of the Amalekite that came to David with the news of Saul was a strange story. David did not consider these enemies worthy of death at his hand because they were, in Saul's case, anointed by God to be king over Israel. Ishbosheth not so much, but he still honored the memory of Saul and Jonathan, his son, and not having this desire to kill Ishbosheth. This is a peculiar thing, but the nature of man is to kill his enemy, and David did not have that disposition toward the house of Saul in any way, apparently, which would explain the longevity of the war that had existed between Israel and Judah during this time period. And I read a lot between the lines there to say that David's war was probably a one of defense rather than offense, and the war Israel waged was probably one of offense rather than defense. But I think that that's consistent with the behavior we see here laid out in chapter 4, and it's consistent with the discussion that was made regarding that war in chapter 3. As David fought that war, Judah grew stronger while Israel grew weaker. So these certainly were dishonorable men who were servants of the house of Saul to come and kill their master and take the head to David with expectation of being lifted up by David. They certainly did not know David. Had they done any investigation into David's true nature, perhaps they would have found out this story about the Amalekite and been a little more careful. So it is what it is. The story of Ishbosheth is very disheartening, as is the story of Saul and Jonathan. It's very sad to see the result of a family given over to denying the power of God in their leadership, denying the authority of God to lead Israel through them when God had put them into that position so plainly. Saul's disregard for the direction of the Lord resulted in the deaths of so many in his family. Now we'll see that Mephibosheth is preserved by David, and that's an interesting story in and of itself, and we'll get to that in a chapter soon. Going on into today's reading, after the burial of Ishbosheth's head at Hebron in Abner's tomb, the tribes of Israel finally come to David in verse 1, saying, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So the people of Israel knew this very well, which might explain their disposition toward Abner, and Abner's disposition toward them out of chapter 3, where we see that they had apparently pursued this relationship with David from time to time, even as Israel warred with Judah. So continuing in verse 3, so all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. I'm not sure that their anointing had any significance to the Lord, but as far as making it official to them, David was now king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So this again is an interesting thing that we'll see through the accounting of the kings, their longevity, and the specifics about the way that they ruled before the Lord. We'll mostly read these at the end of their rule, but here we have an accounting for David at the beginning of his reign. And we see that that accounting begins with his reign over Judah long before he became king over all Israel, which is interesting to me. We often account David as the second king over Israel, when in fact, if you look at the way that David honored Ishbosheth, it makes you give some consideration to Ishbosheth's reign as king, even though it was more of a puppet for Abner. Continuing in verse 6, the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. Now, we hadn't read much about the Jebusites, but the Jebusites were in control of what would become Jerusalem, as we read about it later, also having been known as Salem and several other names previously recorded. But they kind of rebuked David, saying, "You will not come in here, but the blind and lame will ward you off," meaning that even blind and lame guards could keep you from entering into this stronghold of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was built on the top of a mountain, and it was very difficult for an army of men to prevail against the walls of Jerusalem. But David had a plan. In verse 8 he says, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind." making fun of their claim that he would not prevail against the guards of Jerusalem. He did not have anything against particularly blind or lame people, I don't think, but it would be a matter that would come into play later on. Who are hated by David's soul, it says in the end of verse 8. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So this became a thing later on, but it was not rooted in, I don't believe, that any truth that truly blind and lame people were guarding the walls of Jerusalem. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Milo inward. And if you'll recall some of the sermons that Scott has given in the past about the architecture and structure of the city of Jerusalem, it is quite impressive. And even at this point, though considerably smaller than Jerusalem would be later on under other kings, it was very fortified and could withstand much in the way of an onslaught of an enemy. Continuing in verse 10, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So David received these blessings from the Lord as the Lord blessed him and continued with him. So Jerusalem was a mighty city, a mighty fortress, but David knew a secret about the city, and that was that there were wells for the city. That's how they got their water and were able to withstand the onslaughts of sieges. They could get water even though there would be a siege, because they had these water shafts, and David utilized those to infiltrate the city and take it over. Continuing in verse 11, Hiram king of Tyre sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and also carpenters and masons who built David a house. So the mighty cedars of Lebanon were used to build David's house. These were tremendously large trees, famously historical in their nature, well known throughout the old world as a wonder in the world, and very similar, I would think, to the trees that we see on the west coast in our large tree forests. I don't believe there's many of those left. If there's any, I'm not aware of them. But you know that Lebanon's flag bears the picture of a cedar. Those were the cedars of Lebanon. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, it continues in verse 12, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So David recognized that this was not just a blessing to him, but a blessing on the people of Israel. Continuing in verse 13, we see that David took concubines and wives from Jerusalem, and it gives an accounting of the remaining sons of David. And we read those to be Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. We're going to read more about some of these sons later on. Continuing in verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out over the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. So David's first concern was to go to God and find out what God would advise him to do. And this is as good an example as we'll find of this behavior in David. David chose to take counsel of the Lord before he made decisions, and that is a very important difference between David and Saul. And we see that even as David ruled over Judah, but now as he's king over all of Israel, he does this same thing. The Lord promises that he will give them into their hand. So David goes up and he comes to Baal Perazim and defeats them there. And it says that the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. And therefore they named that place Baal Perazim, because the Philistines left their idols there. And David and his men carried them away. In verse 22, it continues, the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David again inquired of the Lord. But this time the Lord said, you shall not go up, but go around to their rear, and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of their balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. So in this case, it's like the Lord took it upon himself to bring an army against the Philistines. And David was just waiting for that to occur. But in verse 25 it says, "And David did as the Lord commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer." So there was a mighty slaughter of the Philistines at the hand of David, even though the Lord had gone out before him to defeat the army of the Philistines. It's an incredible thing to have the Lord on your side. And why would we want to give that up? Let's always make provision in our lives to go to the Lord first, ask him his direction in the things we do. Take that as an admonishment from this chapter, an encouragement to do that in your own life, to put the Lord first by going to him first. Put the Lord first and bringing your troubles and the trials of your life to him first. Ask him the direction that you should take and let him lead you in the path that he has set before you. He'll do it. He'll do these things for us as he did them for David, and we can take that as an assurance from the promise we have in the New Testament as well. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's lesson. It's a mighty story of God working through the lives of men to achieve his ends, and we see this as a mighty beginning to David's reign, and all the struggles that he will face are rooted here in these chapters. We're going to see that he faces them with the help of the Lord, even his own shortcomings. So we'll continue next week, Lord willing, reading through 1 Chronicles chapters 11 and 12, looking at how they address some of the things that we have not read here in 2 Samuel, but that occurred in this time frame. We'll read through a lot of it. Probably won't read through all of it because a lot of it's just a lot of names and stuff. But we'll cover hopefully all of 11 and 12 in one sitting, so we can come back here and continue forward in 2 Samuel chapter 6 in hopefully a couple of weeks. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless and have a great week.